Good afternoon, everybody. This is Ben Tomczyk from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for our webinar, What's the Status of the COVID Relief Money? Before we begin, just a few housewarming measures. First off, as you can see, we are recording this webinar and we will be sharing it on social media tomorrow, and you will also get a copy of the presentation as well. As always, if you're enjoying our webinars, we hope you share them with your friends and encourage them to sign up for future webinars. In addition to that, we will be taking questions after Mark's presentation. To submit a question, please go to the bottom of your screen and using the Q&A feature, you can submit your question there. Also, for those of you who submitted your questions online, I do have them and we will be getting to them after Mark's presentation. And now I'd like to turn the presentation over to my colleague, Mark Goldwine. Mark is the Senior Vice President and Senior Policy Director at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Mark, thank you so much for joining us. And I think the question to start is, it's been 2 months since we signed the CARES Act. Where are we right now?
Thank you, everyone, for attending this webinar today. I think this is our fourth or fifth, and every time my hair is a little bit longer and maybe a little bit grayer, but hopefully I'll have more interesting stuff to tell you. As always, now is the awkward moment where I try to share my screen with you, which should take a second, but hopefully folks can see it now and I'll get started. I have a very long deck. I'm going to go through it relatively quickly, but then it's going to be posted on our website, crfb.org, if you want to learn about it in more detail. I do want to leave a lot of time for questions at the end. But let me try to answer this question that was posed, which is, we are about 2 months after the CARES Act. The CARES Act passed about 2 months ago. We're about 3 months since kind of the pandemic started. So where are we? Oh, and now my screen is frozen, excuse me. Here we go. So, you know, we know, and I won't go over this again in too much detail, but the economy clearly faces really what is unprecedented, at least since the Great Depression damage. There are likely around 30 million people out of work right now, 25 million more than there were at the end of last year, plus, you know, the 5 million that are already unemployed. You know, the economy has contracted by about 12 or 13%. We think. I mean, this is pretty severe, pretty steep damage that happened very fast. At the same time, policymakers at kind of all levels of government have really committed trillions of dollars to save it. So by our estimates, the Federal Reserve has committed about $6 trillion and may go above that because they keep committing more. Through legislative action, we've committed about 3.6 trillion of support. You know, we hear the number 2.5 trillion, that's the deficit impact, but 3.6 is how much money is going to be going to the economy in the near term. And the administration has taken actions like delaying tax season and delaying student loans that probably offer another 400 billion or so of support. That's a lot of money. I mean, you shouldn't add these numbers together, they are non-additive. But if you were to add them together anyway, we're talking about $10 trillion of support, which is half the size of 1 year's of GDP or a quarter the size of 2 years GDP. This is very large size economic relief. But I think the big question is, we've done it not through kind of one big initiative, but through a bunch of pieces of legislation, 4 pieces of legislation, so actually, as well as a number of different Federal Reserve measures. And if you check out our website, COVID Money Tracker, we're following each of these pieces of legislation, how much you know, was allocated, essentially how much has been dispersed and what's the deficit impact. And same with all these Federal Reserve actions. But the question is, out of all this, we know that, you know, trillions and trillions of dollars have been committed, but how much has actually been dispersed and where is it going? And most importantly, is it working? If you visit covidmoneytracker.org, we are trying to answer at least those first 2 questions. And we're going to do so in a more sophisticated way through a state-of-the-art interactive database that we hope will be out next month. But I want to kind of tease out some of these questions for now. Now let's start with the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve got its initial money out fast. Okay, on March 3rd, they cut the interest rate by half a point, by over half a point, excuse me. And then on March 15th, they cut it down to 0. We'd already had some interest rate cuts earlier in the year, but essentially they cut interest rates very early in this process. The national emergency was declared right in the middle of March. That's around that same time, that middle week of March, they bought trillions of dollars of mortgage-backed securities, about $2 trillion worth of mortgage-backed securities and long-term treasuries, and engaged in a number of liquidity measures, basically repo measures. You can see right here, between February 26th and May 27th, they expanded their balance sheet by $3 trillion. And if you kind of eyeball this, you can see most of that happened really quickly. Most of that happened by mid to late March. The Fed acted really fast on this liquidity measures. Now it's acting a lot more slowly when it comes to some of these targeted lending programs. I think we've heard a lot about these new ways the Federal Reserve is lending: the primary credit facilities, the municipal liquidity facility, the Main Street business lending facility. These all sorts of different ways the Fed is trying to get money in the economy. They announced a lot of these in mid to late March, but just now is money starting to get out the door. The corporate credit facility didn't make its first purchase till May 12th, and it's still only purchased a few $1 billion. The municipal lending facility hasn't even started yet. The Main Street lending facility may be starting, as soon as tomorrow, very soon, but isn't there yet. So this money is starting. They announced it's early, but it's still kind of slow going, and not much has been done here. Now, what about fiscal policy? We're the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, not Committee for Responsible Federal Reserve. So most of our focus is on fiscal policy. And here you can see about half the money in total has gone out the door. To understand what this graph is showing you, this top line, this is how much has been committed by kind of major program. Paycheck protection, these are the tax rebates, unemployment benefits, business tax relief. By the way, a lot of this is just deferral of payroll taxes. So we don't it's not that we're cutting taxes by that much, it's a lot of deferral. Economic stabilization, which is money mostly to support the Federal Reserve and loans, provider relief fund, aid to states, all this other money. This top amount is how much has been committed. And this solid amount is how much of that has gone out. You can see for things like paycheck protection, the economic impact payments, some of them, most of the money has gone out. For others, we're still making our way through it. But if you add all this together, roughly half the money has gone out so far. And in that half, by the way, includes about 90%, at least 90% of projected spending on the economic impact payments, those $1,200 per person rebates. We passed the CARES Act March 27th. The national emergency was March 13th. No money went out for about the first 2 weeks after the CARES Act. And then in the first day, I think around April 14th, 150 billion, about half of all of this rebates went out through direct deposit. And they've continued to go out over time pretty rapidly. So there was a period where people were not getting money. For the most part, people have gotten these checks pretty quick. Paycheck protection has also gone relatively quick. Again, it wasn't immediate. It wasn't as fast as a lot of businesses hoped. The CARES Act passed on March 27th. There was some talk money would go out the next Monday. In reality, it did take longer than that, but money was out within a couple of weeks. And the first round of funds ran out really fast in about a week and a half. But we then enacted a second round of funds, and we're now at the point that although there's still plenty of money left in the Paycheck Protection Program, around 150 billion, we're getting very few new applications. So it seems like we've roughly saturated demand for the Paycheck Protection loans, which is the forgivable loans for small business. Other money has also been going out. This is just an example of airline support, but you can look throughout the CARES Act, throughout the other pieces of legislation. And by the way, maybe the slowest struggle, but the thing that's really starting to move is unemployment benefits. We started getting big spikes in initial claims and unemployment in mid to late March, March 21st, March 28th. The CARES Act passed March 27th. The CARES Act created all sorts of new things, like a $600 benefit increase and extended benefits and expanded eligibility to gig workers and business owners. And it took a while for states to get this up and running and really get the money out. And so you can see initial claims start really high. These are continuing claims, which is probably a better indicator of the number of people on the program with a little bit of a lag. So maybe take the continuing claims and add a million or so, a million or two. You can see the claims started real fast. The money started a little slower, but now it's catching up to the point that we have a lot of money out the door. We were spending about $1 billion a year for a couple of million folks back in the end of February. Now we're spending, excuse me, $1 billion a week. Now we're spending about 20 to 25 billion a week for 25 to 30 million Americans collecting unemployment benefits. So that money took a while to get started, but is now going out pretty rapidly. So I think a question, the underlying narrative here, I think, is the money came out slower than people needed it, but surprisingly fast, faster than really any legislation has sent money out before. And even though it was a bit of a slow start, it's now kind of all making its way into the economy. Most people that are applying for unemployment benefits are getting them. Most businesses that are applying for loans are getting them. Most people have gotten their checks. The money is out there. But the question is it working? And to be honest, we don't know. It's too early to tell. But we can look at some data that gives us some clues. First of all, we know that unemployment job losses continue to mount. They do appear to be slowing a bit. They may pick back up. Some of the slowing is that I think there's some people coming back from furlough as some states are reopening. But there's continued job losses. So if the goal of the CARES Act was to stop all the job losses, if the goal of the legislation, that hasn't worked. But it's very possible, and I think very likely, job losses would have been more severe without this legislation. Now, what about income? So if you go from January or February, let's say February was kind of peak income, to April, we have some really good data from, this says Council of Economic Advisors, but I think that's a mistake. I think it may be the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So excuse the source. But we have some data that shows that market income, even after taxes, has gone down about 10%, meaning the income you get from wages and salary and dividends and interest and your business income gone down about 10%. That's pretty severe. Even when you add in government transfers, things like Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and food stamps, income has still gone down 7%. So those normal transfers are only buffering a small amount of that income loss. But then when you account for the unemployment benefits and the economic impact payments that are almost entirely the result of the CARES Act, what you see is that income between February and April has actually risen by 13%. In a period of unprecedented economic collapse, we're actually seeing an unprecedented rise in income. I'm not sure of any point in the history where we've seen income go up 13% over 2 months. So this is a pretty impressive stat. And what it tells us is that the CARES Act and other legislation is working to get money into people's pockets. It is working to not only replace the losses of market income, but more than replace it. Replace it, several times over, leaving us with several times over the loss, leaving us instead of with a 10% loss with a 13% increase. Now you can see most of that is these one-time checks from the economic payments. Those aren't going to continue. Not all the checks are out, but about 3/4 of the checks were out, and that really was what was driving April. But if we extrapolate this out to May, and I took the liberty of basically assuming government transfers and market income are flat, which I think is a bad assumption. My guess is market income is down, government transfers are up. It's probably a little bit of a loss overall. But since we don't have the data, just for simplicity, if we assume those are flat, what you'll see is the economic impact payments go down, but the unemployment benefits in May are much larger than in April. And still, income is significantly higher in May than in February. We are replacing all of the lost income plus 3%, plus the extra stuff you have from April, right, which you could have saved. Now, as another thought experiment, let's assume that even though the economic impact payments were received over 1 month, people are really not treating them as 1 month's income, right? They're treating them as to kind of space out over, say, 4 months. And so if we amortize those rebates over 4 months, assume that, each of April, May, June, July, or people take a fourth of that check and count it as income. Again, same story. Income is up in May. And even if you assume that market income is down, fell as much in May as it did in April, it still would be the case that the CARES Act and other legislation has replaced lost income. And that's likely to be true through the end of July. In other words, I think we can conclude pretty safely that the legislation passed so far has done enough to keep households whole in terms of their income through the end of July. But what are they doing with that money? I think is an important question. One thing it appears they're doing is paying rent. In April, there were about 8% of households that didn't pay their rent by the end of the month, by the 27th, and about another 22% that didn't pay it by the beginning of the month, by the 6th. So we're kind of, you could think of that loosely as late payments, right? So 30% of people had late payments or no payments at all. In May, it was down to 25%, and only 6.5%, 6.7% not paying at all. That's still higher than May of 2019, but pretty close. I mean, it seems pretty clear that's what's happening is people with these unemployment benefits and checks are now going back to paying their rent, and that's important. But for the most part, people are saving the money. This again is from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. We kind of stole a graph design idea from the Wall Street Journal that put the income and the uses of income next to each other. This is annualized, but something is clear. Income has gone up, savings has gone up even more. So people are not only saving all the new money they're getting, they're also saving the earnings they still have, which not surprising given how hard it is actually to go out and spend money right now. It's not like people are going to restaurants and bars and movie theaters and malls and things like that. And the concern about the future is leading to more precautionary savings. This savings in some ways is discouraging because it means that they're not putting the money into the economy to boost it. But in other ways, it's encouraging because it means that people will have robust balance sheets when they come out of this, or at least robust balance sheets through the end of July. When I keep using the end of July because that's when the unemployment benefits end, and they fall $600 back to where they were before. At that point, people are going to start drawing through the savings, perhaps pretty quickly in some cases. Despite all this, consumer confidence remains low. It's increased a bit between April and May, but still, people are very concerned about the state of the economy, very concerned about the state of the market. Now, what about businesses? So here's some good news. Businesses are actually getting their loans. The census started doing weekly survey data. Sadly, we only have 4 weeks so far, but basically from the end of April to the middle of May. As of the end of April, 3/4 of small businesses had applied for a paycheck protection loan, but only 40% had received it. As of mid-May, 70% out of 75 had received it. So almost all the businesses had received it. I imagine that number is even higher today. Similar story for economic injury disaster loan payments, not quite as high received, but same story. And this clearly has had an effect on cash on hand. Back at the last week of April, 50% of businesses had less than a month's worth of business operations on hand, which means that if they were fully shut down for more than a month, they'd go out of business. Only 40% had more than a month. Now, 57% have more than a month, and only 33% have less than a month. It's not as if everything is hunky-dory and we've saved the small businesses, but it is clear that they have a lot more cash now, which means they have a lot more time to figure things out. But for the most part, they're not bringing back their workers. They are bringing back some. We are seeing some amount of rehiring. This is, by the way, Insta data that Chetty and Friedman and others have put together through tracktherecovery.org. Very cool website. They are trying to do instantaneous economic data. By definition, that means it's probably going to be not great data, but it's the best data we have, and it tells us almost to the day. We are seeing some rehiring, but for the most part, most of those jobs, people are furloughed or still furloughed. People that lost those jobs are still lost. Small businesses are not rehiring en masse. Maybe they will at some point. Now, lastly, I'll turn to what the Fed is doing. It's clear that the Fed, by cutting interest rates and unlimited bond buying, has kept Treasury rates very low. And in fact, if you tuned into our last webinar, you can see that the Fed has sort of bought as much in debt as the Treasury has issued, which is not the same as that the Fed is monetizing the debt. But what it does show is that they're at least allowing the market to be big enough. There's no question we'll go to issue the debt. But it also turns out that the Fed has really stabilized the corporate bond market. And it's done it actually by just announcing that it would. This tells you how powerful Fed credibility is. On March 23rd, the Federal Reserve announced that they would be doing a bond buying program for corporate bonds. You can see this is kind of the yields. This is kind of the return to sort of safer corporate bonds and to more risky corporate bonds. When the yield goes up, it's because things are riskier. So you can see the yields going up starting in March, going up. Fed announces it, the yields come back down. Not to where they were before, nor should they. There's a pandemic. These bonds are riskier and they should be priced that way, but way down from this spike. And then when on April 9th, the Fed announced that they'd be buying High yield bonds, not just, which means sort of riskier junk bonds, it went down even more. And then when they actually began the big bond buying program, went down a bit more, although really the story here is the announcement more than the purchase itself, because once they announced, that really quelled the markets. You can see the same thing looking in reverse, looking at kind of the value. Yields and values are kind of go in reverse, right? Because the less that you buy for the less that you pay for something, the higher return you're getting for any given percent return for any given amount of cash. So you can see the same deal. These are a few bond indices. You can see that the indices kind of tank here, and when the Fed announces the program, they start to recover. And by the way, you can see a little the same thing happening with the stock market, which is a little bit more indirect. But it does appear that the Fed has had a significant help in boosting the bond market. And by the way, they've done that despite the fact they've only bought something like $2 or $3 billion, we think. We don't have the exact numbers, but worth of corporate bonds. And they bought it all through index funds. They haven't bought very much, but they announced they would buy up to $750 billion. And that's made a big difference, even if they never actually do most of that buying. Now, this isn't all over. You know, I've said a few times, I think what we can conclude is not too much, but I think what we can see here is clearly the economic measures haven't done enough to bring the economy back. And we wouldn't expect that, right? The economy is not fundamentally damaged because of people are scared to buy things. It's fundamentally damaged because we have a pandemic and people aren't out there buying things. People aren't going to work, people aren't going to market. And so we wouldn't expect fiscal policy to be able to get us out of that, and it hasn't. But what is clear is that after a slow start to get the money out, a lot of this money is now getting out the door. And as a result, it probably is going to put us in a position that many individuals and businesses will be able to stay whole, will be able to stay okay through July. After that, things get tough. State and local governments face hundreds of billions of dollars of lost revenue this year, next year, and the year after. For this fiscal year, which ends July 1, their rainy day funds should cover the loss, and they should be okay. Or cover enough of the loss, and they should be okay. But for their next fiscal year and for the fiscal year to that, states are in big trouble. And if there's no federal aid, they're going to have to start having big tax increases and layoffs. Meanwhile, small businesses, again, while they have a lot of cash on hand, that Paycheck Protection Program is really only supposed to provide 8 weeks worth of funding or 10 weeks worth of funding, depending on how you look at it. So that money is going to start to run dry too. And I don't think anyone thinks the economy is going to be at full reopen mode by the time this money runs out, which means that we may need to be looking more ways to support small businesses through the end of the year for a prolonged period of time. Maybe not as aggressive as paycheck protection, but probably something. And then there's the extended unemployment benefits, especially that $600 boost per week. That ends completely at the end of July. And there's a lot of disagreement over whether we should extend that and how. Two things are clear to me. The one is if you don't extend it, there will be a significant cliff in income where folks that were having their income more or less replaced, in some cases more than replaced over time, no longer will be. And that cliff would happen all at once. On the other hand, if you extend the 600 as is, especially during a reopening phase, that can create some serious work disincentives and make it very hard for firms to hire and get people back. Because for many folks and in many states, unemployment now pays more than working. Someone making $15 an hour in New York gets about 50% more in unemployment than going back to work. So I think policymakers are discussing, is there some kind of third way? Is there a period you'd want to phase it down or replace it with work bonuses? And they'll have to figure that out, but they need to figure out whatever they're going to do before the end of July. The House has a proposal out there. It says $3 trillion, which is what we thought it was. We actually just got a CBO score that it's about $3.5 trillion. It's a mix of addressing a lot of these issues, probably in some cases throwing more money at the problem than is needed. I think there's some analysis that the aid to state and local governments is significantly larger than what their shortfalls are going to be. And then providing some policies that we can get into, but really aren't particularly related to the crisis at all. But from the HEROES Act, from the House Act, I think are probably a lot of elements that are going to be considered as we discuss a possible phase 4 or phase 5, or what we're talking about next, which may be needed or desirable for the post-summer period. And by the way, when this is all done, we're going to have to figure out the debt issue. You know, it makes sense to borrow when you're in a recession. It makes sense to borrow when you're trying to manage a very high one-time cost like a pandemic. And so it's reasonable, justified, and inevitable that our debt is going to be rising a lot now. And the debt is going to be about as large as the economy by the end of the year. But it doesn't make debt costless. Debt still has a cost. It still has a fiscal cost. It still has an economic cost. It still creates a sustainability issue. And over the medium and long term, if we don't address it, we're going to face continued ongoing economic pain. And so when we're on the other end of this, we are going to have to address that debt issue. And I'll give a quick plug that there's 60 House lawmakers that are looking to do just that, that have asked that the next package includes something that just start the process for long-term deficit reduction. Things like asking the Comptroller General to give an address on this fiscal state of the nation, or creating new commissions that can put our trust funds into a long-term sustainable path, or looking at long-term debt targets, things like that. And that's sensible in the sense that once we get through the economic damage of the current crisis, we're going to clean up the mess. And a big piece of that is going to be putting our debt in a more sustainable trajectory. At this point, I think we have a little survey for you all, then I would love to take questions.
We do, Mark, and thank you so much for that great overview. We do have a quick survey. So you've just heard Mark's presentation about the status of COVID relief, and we want to ask you this question. Do you think the CARES Act and other COVID economic relief measures have been effective so far? We'd like to hear from those of you. We'll give folks about 30 seconds, and then we will reveal the results. In the meantime, for those of you who have asked, we will be sharing both the webinar in this presentation tomorrow. You will be getting it in an email. Give folks another 5-10 seconds to respond.
Looks like the votes are still coming in. But we can do the first question while people are voting, if you'd like.
Sure, let's do that. So, Mark, we've had 2 questions on state and local financial assistance, both online and during your presentation. You talked about the rainy day funds, but you also talked about the fact that states may have to do tax hikes. Can you talk about what does the likely financial assistance to state and federal localities look like in a potential next bill?
So the numbers in this are all over the place. So I'm going to give you some numbers that I think are kind of, in my head, the rough median of the consensus, but it's a wide range. But essentially, over the next 3 years, states and municipalities face something like $700 billion of shortfalls as a result of mainly as a result of the lost revenue from the current economic crisis. Right, this isn't their underlying shortfall. This is the additional shortfall because when there's shutdowns, people aren't going out to buy stuff and there's no sales tax, right? And when people are unemployed, there's no income tax. Roughly $700 billion. That's unprecedented. Now, many states have prepared for a recession. Some states have done so very poorly, but many states have very robust rainy day funds. The problem is those rainy day funds in total carry about $150 billion. Maybe $100 billion, depending on how you look at it and whether I'm remembering the numbers exactly right. So they're still short. And we have given some aid to states, but in terms of sort of unrestricted aid or aid they can really use to cover this, it's maybe only another $100 billion. So when you take their starting shortfall and you subtract what they have in their rainy day funds and what we've already given them, we're still talking about something in the broad range of $500 billion that states are going to be short. If we tell states they need to solve this entirely on their own, and municipalities, the result will be they will have a choice. And the answer in almost every state will have to do both. They will have to dramatically raise taxes on their citizens or on their residents, or they will have to significantly cut services. And that will include, by the way, laying off a lot of state and local workers like teachers and police and firefighters and municipal workers and sanitation workers and things like that. And probably they'll have to do both. And so there's a lot of talk about giving states aid. Where I think that there's valid concern about giving states aid is in two ways. One is we don't want to reward states for past bad behavior. We don't want to reward states who let their pensions get out of control and say, don't worry, we'll bail out your pension. Or states that really just have been in long-term imbalance, or states that have overly generous benefits or keep cutting taxes in good times and then hope the federal government is going to bail them out in bad times, or who refuse to build up their rainy day funds. And we probably shouldn't do that. On the other hand, states have balanced budget requirements. So even though the Fed is actually stepping in to help them with some of their debt, they're not allowed to, on a sustained basis, spend significantly more than they raise in revenue. They can borrow to cover, to kind of manage over time, and they can borrow if their budget happens to be off, but they really have to get their budgets into balance for the most part. And given that we probably want to avoid the tax increases and spending cuts as large as I described, there probably will need to be, and I think there's a rough consensus, some amount of state and local aid. And the question is, what does it look like? Do we distribute it based on population, or based on COVID cases, or based on economic need? Do we use existing programs like Medicaid and increase their match? Do we put more money in their education system? Do we subsidize their workers directly? Like we did with Paycheck Protection, where we say, we'll pay you for X percent of your payroll. Do we have conditions tied to these? And I think these are all good and valid questions. And for a while, I've been of the school of thought that we have time to sit and think and get this right. And that's still true, but time is starting to run a little shorter because the state fiscal year starts on July 1st. And while not absolutely necessary, like states aren't going to fold like small businesses, it would be beneficial for their budgets if we could figure out what kind of state aid we're giving, at least some amount of it, before that July 1 deadline. And my one big piece of advice would be, as we figure that out, we should think about the types of policies that are built around the need and contingent, and two-sided in nature. So for example, if we're gonna have policies that have higher Medicaid matching rates when times are bad, we should have states contribute more to Medicaid when times are good, things like that.
So Mark, I wanna show the results of our poll here. And so when we asked all of you to vote, here are the responses. Do you think the CARES Act and other COVID economic relief measures have been effective so far? 66% of you said yes, 8% of you said no, and 25% of you said unsure. Mark, I want to go to our next question that was submitted just a few moments ago, asking, as we're looking at the relief and the recovery efforts so far, have there been any programs that we have found to be extremely effective, and what have been the best? And are there any that have been disappointing?
Well, I think most programs have both been disappointing and extremely effective. So, for example, the unemployment benefits were really disappointing in how long it took for people to be able to get them, how hard it was for states to manage them, and how, I think we really learned that, first of all, it's understandable states' infrastructure weren't built for that many millions of people applying all at once. That's never happened before. But their computer systems are still in the Stone Ages, and they're sending stuff out on dot matrix paper. So I think that was really disappointing. On the other hand, it's been very effective as income replacement once it's come in. It really is making, we see the data, it is making people's income whole. On the other hand, while that's helpful for making people's income whole, it's gonna create challenges and potentially be very damaging when we're in reopen mode and trying to rehire people. Similarly, Paycheck Protection, I think there's a lot of disappointment about the money went out very fast, too fast. People didn't understand how to use it. There was a lot of bureaucracy. At first, it felt like only the big firms were getting it, which wasn't really true, but it felt that way. I kind of talked to 20 plus small businesses, and even the ones that got it kind of felt that way. And then the money started coming in, and now people, I think, are starting to, businesses are starting to feel a little optimistic having that money. And there's new rules there's new rules that passed the House that are going to be considered in the Senate that will maybe give them even more flexibility. So, I've been ranting for a while. Rambling for a while is a long way to say that I don't think there's any program that's worked perfectly. I don't think there's any program so far that's been a total disaster either. But we've had surprises in both directions.
We have a question that was submitted online in advance of the webinar, and the questioner writes, what is the status of efforts to repeal all or part of the $170 billion of cost provisions that lifted restrictions in the use of tax losses, especially that part making it retroactive to previous fiscal years?
So during the CARES Act, one element of the CARES Act essentially allowed businesses to deduct more of their losses. Historically, you'd be able to, in many cases, deduct all of your losses, or at least all of your losses in bad times. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act restricted how much losses. This allowed them to deduct their losses. That was something that CRFB, that our organization, was not super keen on, because we didn't think it was relevant enough to the current crisis that it made sense. With that said, there was an argument for it. The argument was essentially that businesses needed liquidity, and especially during a period of time that they were facing major losses, and this would help give them the liquidity. So again, it was something that we sort of opposed because we thought it was more about undermining the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, but there was a case for it. With that said, I'm not sure it's the most targeted way to support the money. In the House bill, which spends $2.5 trillion, actually does repeal that provision. Without that, it would be, seriously, 3.5. Without that, it'd be $3.7 trillion. I don't think it's very likely that repeal is going to go anywhere. So I think that new loss rule is going to remain into effect, at least for the course of this fiscal year. My hope is that we don't move to make this a permanent policy, or if we do make it a permanent policy, we only do so with responsible offsets, because the last thing we need is to make the 2017 tax cuts an even bigger debt buster.
Thanks, Mark. We had one person write in, given the amount of debt the U.S. has taken on in response to the pandemic and the actions of the Federal Reserve, are we not just moving to an economic system that is more in line with modern monetary theory? Yes or no?
No, I don't think that's the case. Modern monetary theory basically says that in normal times, the federal government should essentially print money. It's more complicated, oversimplifying. Should essentially print money to run its deficits, and then it should keep running deficits until the point that you get inflation, and then it should stop running deficits. That's not what we're saying at all here. What we're saying here is more akin traditional Keynesian stimulus, or even just a traditional cash management, which is when you have a acute horrible event, you spend what you need to address that event, and you figure out how to finance it over time, right? As we've done with every single war in our history. And when you have an economic downturn, you use borrowing to support the economy to some degree. And then when you have good times, you bring it back down. So I don't think that what we're doing is akin to modern monetary theory, which says we print money in all times and only worry when there's inflation. I think this is more akin to a combination of traditional sort of budget management and traditional Keynesian economics, where you borrow when things are bad, understanding that there is a cost, but that it's easier to address that cost when things are good. And that's what we need to do. Once we're through this, we need to figure out how to get our debt under control.
Mark, this will be our final question. You talked about, once we get past July, things can get really tough. Someone wrote in, how can we make sure that whatever the next round of relief efforts are passed, that they are targeted to address those communities that are low income or disproportionately impacted by the pandemic?
I think this is exactly the most important question, because when we passed the CARES Act and the other pieces of legislation, the number one goal was get money out fast. And it was okay if it wasn't very well targeted, if it wasn't as well targeted as it usually would, because we didn't have time to figure all the targeting. But you know what? Now we have time. We have from the CARES Act mid-March through essentially the end of July, ideally through the end of June, so we can get states money, but really through the end of July to figure this out. And so we're going to need to spend more money, most likely, but we got to spend it a lot smarter than we spend the last money. And we need to really focus on where's there the most need? Where can we do the most to help support the economic recovery while helping to protect balance sheets? How can we keep businesses that are actually in danger from going under, rather than subsidizing everyone even that doesn't need it. And that's kind of like the $1 trillion question, because we could probably do for $500 billion what we're going to end up doing for $1 trillion, because that's the consequence of spending inefficiently, is you add more to the debt than what you need, or alternatively, you don't do as much good for each dollar you spend. And so I really would demand, not that there not be more COVID relief, not that we reduce deficits today, but that we start spending our money wisely, not like it's infinite, because this is going to be a long slog until the economy is fully recovered. And if we don't spend it wisely now, we're not going to have the political will to keep doing what's necessary.
Well, Mark, let me first off say thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. For those of you who are interested in doing a deeper dive into some of the stuff Mark talked about, we encourage you to visit the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget's new COVID Money Tracker. You can go to that by typing in covidmoneytracker.org, and it'll take you to that website. Once again, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to connecting with you on a future webinar. Have a great day, everybody.